HOA fined me for lake access violations before I even finished my morning walk. The chain clanged against the dock as Ethan Walker stopped cold, mist rolling off the water and curling around his boots. The sun was barely up, the lake smooth as glass, the kind of quiet his grandfather used to call sacred. He had the old wooden oars balanced on his shoulder when he saw it. Its bright yellow links stretched tight across the only public boat ramp. "Sir, step away from the ramp." Ethan turned. A woman in a pressed blazer stood near the shore, clipboard in hand, HOA badge catching the light. "That ramp's public," Ethan said. She flipped a page without looking at him. Multiple complaints, restricted access, violations, daily fines start now. Continued interference will be taken to court. Behind her, families slowed on the trail. Neighbors whispered. Kids stared at the lock like it had always been there. Ethan's grip tightened on the oars. That ramp wasn't just wood and bolts, it was his grandfather's work. His inheritance. He stared at the chain, then at her pen moving like judgment. Under his breath, he said, "They have no idea what they've started." The lake didn't feel like water to Ethan Walker. It felt like history. As he stood there staring at the chained ramp, his mind slid backward years, decades into mornings filled with coffee steam and birdsong when his boots were too big and his grandfather's hands were rough with sawdust and lake spray. He could see it clearly. The dock wasn't here yet, just raw shoreline and stacked planks. His grandfather, shirt sleeves rolled, hammer tucked into his belt, measuring twice before driving every nail. Ethan had been 8, holding boards he could barely lift, pretending the weight didn't matter. "Straight lines matter," his grandfather had said, tapping the wood. "So does letting folks through. Water don't belong to one man." They'd fished from that half-built dock at sunset, lines humming while neighbors wandered down with folding chairs. Nobody asked permission. Nobody charged a fee. Boats launched because the lake was for everyone. That was the rule long before any committee ever wrote one. After his grandparents passed, the cabin came to Ethan with a ring of old keys and a box of papers no one else wanted to sort through. He'd opened drawers that smelled like cedar and oilcloth, finding brittle envelopes, yellow maps, notebooks filled with looping handwriting. One journal mentioned shoreline easements in neat columns. Another listed dates and signatures from county clerks long retired. When city life burned him out, he came back here, not to hide, but to protect what had been handed down. He ran his fingers over the cabin desk that morning, remembering how the bottom drawer stuck unless you lifted it just right. Inside were the deeds, the plats, the same ones his grandfather had sworn would matter someday. "People forget," the old man used to say. "Paper lasts." There hadn't been an HOA then. No boards, no badges, just neighbors who waved and helped mend nets. Ethan had promised out loud, standing by that dock the week he inherited it, that nothing would change on his watch. The ramp stayed open. The lake stayed shared. Whatever this was, it wasn't ending quietly. The letter was waiting in his mailbox before the fog even burned off the lake. Ethan recognized the envelope, instantly thick, official, stamped with the HOA's logo like a warning label. He didn't open it right away. He stood there in the gravel drive, listening to gulls cry over the water, already knowing it wouldn't be good. Inside were 3 pages. Notice of sixilation. Unauthorized interference with the lake ACS. The words felt heavy in his hands. They claimed he had altered the public approach to the ramp, that he had installed barriers, that he had discouraged community usage. A fine was already attached, $500 with daily penalties stacking beneath it in neat columns. Another line warned that continued noncompliance could result in liens placed against his property. At the bottom sat an invitation that didn't feel like one at all. Mandatory appearance. HOA board review. That night, Ethan drove to the clubhouse. The parking lot was half full. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over folding chairs arranged in stiff rows. At the front sat 7 board members behind a long table. Coffee cups, nameplates. A framed photo of the lake hung crooked behind them. The president didn't wait for him to sit. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice flat, eyes sharp, "we've received multiple complaints." "From who?" Ethan asked. She ignored the question. "Our records indicate you altered the footpath near the ramp and placed obstacles that discouraged access." "I didn't change anything," Ethan replied. That path's been the same for decades. A man 2 seats down cleared his throat. Residents say otherwise. Ethan turned to the crowd behind him. Most people stared at their laps. A woman he recognized from the walking trail wouldn't meet his eyes. He tried again, slow and steady. If you're talking about the old rope fence that was there when I bought the place, it marks the erosion line. It's not blocking the ramp. The president tapped her pen. Please let us finish, Mr. Walker. He nodded, jaw tight. Another board member leaned forward. Failure to comply could escalate this to legal action. You're threatening to sue me over something I didn't do. We're stating policy, the president replied. You'll remove any obstructions immediately and pay the fines. I'm not paying for something that isn't real. Two people spoke at once. Another cut him off before he could respond. Sir, we have procedures. Procedures that let you fine people without proof, Ethan shot back. The room shifted, chairs creaked, someone coughed. The president's smile didn't reach her eyes. Continued resistance will force us to pursue liens. That word landed hard. Lien, on his cabin, on his grandfather's dock. Ethan looked around again. Still no one spoke. He gathered his jacket slowly, keeping his voice level. You're making a mistake. Meeting adjourned, she said. Outside, cold air slapped his face. He sat in his truck for a long minute, hands locked around the steering wheel, breathing through the heat crawling up his neck. They weren't asking, they were flexing. When he finally drove home, he didn't go inside right away. He walked straight to the cabin desk, yanked open the stubborn bottom drawer, and stacked the deeds, journals, and maps on the table. If they wanted paperwork, he was done trusting their version of it. The lake had never felt so hostile. Ethan Walker arrived at the ramp early one morning, the same oars resting across his shoulder, mist curling around the boards like a warning. He had removed the chain the night before, telling himself it was simply a small act to restore what had always been public. But the yellow links were back. Fresh padlock. Same metal bite against the wood. Someone had been faster, smarter, watching. By the time he got back to the cabin, 3 crisp envelopes were taped to his door. Official HOA letterhead, each one more threatening than the last. Daily fines now doubled. Failure to comply would escalate to full legal action. The words blurred in his vision until he forced himself to read every line. Then came the lawyer's letter. Formal. Cold. The type that didn't ask questions. It stated, immediate compliance required. Escalation to court is inevitable. Ethan counted the mounting penalties. His bank account, once stable, now flickered red numbers in his head like a warning siren. He could feel it. They were trying to make him break. Financially, socially, mentally. Rumors began circulating. Friends whispered behind hands. He's greedy, someone said at the local store. Another claimed he was trying to claim the lake for himself. Neighbors avoided eye contact on the trail. Kids passed by with muted curiosity, their laughter hesitant. Even those who had once waved stopped. The isolation was quiet, but sharp. Nightfall brought sleepless hours. Ethan stared at the ceiling, imagining padlocks snapping into place over his grandfather's dock. Each chain link became a heartbeat of threat. Coffee cups piled up, old journals spread open across the table, and every creak in the cabin floor sounded like a footstep at the door. He started visiting the county records office, poring over decades of documents. Old survey maps, barely legible, contradicting the HOA's claims. Plot lines that ran straight from the lakeshore to his property, verified in hand-scribbled notes by surveyors long gone. Boundaries that had never been disputed now stood in sharp contrast to the board's assertions. Every visit revealed more inconsistencies. A corner of the property had been misread in the last HOA filing. Lines shifted on maps, historical easements ignored. The weight of evidence was building, silently, waiting for a moment to tip the scales. Ethan's resolve hardened, but so did the pressure. Daily fines were adding up. His phone rang with calls he didn't answer. Emails stacked in his inbox like daggers. The community watched from a distance, whispering about the man who refused to yield. At the lake, he noticed how every ripple reflected both the calm of the past and the tension of the present. The dock stood firm, his grandfather's handwriting still legible in the journals. He ran a hand across the top of the desk over deeds and survey sheets, realizing that this fight wasn't just about property anymore. It was about truth, about legacy, about standing against a system designed to intimidate. The HOA had escalated the battle, and the battlefield had widened. Every new citation, every rumor, every locked ramp was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown across his family's history. And now, armed with decades of evidence, Ethan was ready to answer. The quiet lake, which once symbolized peace, had become a mirror of the fight to come. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the only way this ended was in court. For the first time, he allowed himself a cold smile. Let them come. They would see that history and truth had its own weight. Ethan Walker had spent another restless night staring at the ceiling of his cabin, the sound of the lake outside whispering like it was keeping secrets. The chain on the ramp gleamed in the memory of morning sun, and the letters stacked on his desk like a gauntlet of paper. He couldn't fight this alone, not against the HOA, not against a board that seemed to thrive on intimidation, and certainly not when neighbors whispered behind their hands, leaving him isolated in his own home. He made the call the next morning. The line was busy for a moment. Then a calm, professional voice answered. Law offices of Gregory Hanford. How can I help you? Ethan swallowed. I need help with a property dispute. It's complicated. HOA, lake access, historical rights, my grandfather's documents. I'm not sure where to start. There was a pause on the other end. Then a click of a pen. Send me everything you have. Bring the deeds, maps, journals, everything. We'll set up a meeting. 2 days later, Ethan found himself in a small office smelling faintly of leather and paper. Gregory Hanford, the attorney, was in his 50s, calm, observant, with eyes that seemed to measure the truth in a person's voice. Ethan spread the documents across the conference table, yellowed plats, handwritten journals, receipts from surveyors decades old. Hanford leaned forward, turning pages carefully. These are thorough. Most people don't keep this level of detail. He looked at Ethan. Your grandfather anticipated disputes, didn't he? Ethan shrugged. He said paper lasts longer than memory. I think he meant someone would have to prove it someday. Looks like that day is now, Hanford said, tapping a finger on a map that marked the lakefront. There's enough here to challenge the HOA if we proceed correctly. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The next step was allies. He started quietly. Conversations in passing with neighbors, careful questions over fence lines, cups of coffee in the garage of the retired couple who lived 3 doors down. Most hesitated, afraid of retaliation. But a few nodded, almost in secret. We've seen them do this before, one woman whispered. If someone doesn't stand up, nothing will ever change. The retired surveyor, Mr. Thompson, was the first real breakthrough. Ethan had tracked him down through an old county directory. The man's hands were gnarled from decades of measuring land, but his eyes sparkled with recognition when Ethan explained the dispute. I've been looking at plats since before these HOA rules existed, Thompson said. If your grandfather's records are right, they've misrepresented the boundaries. Ethan spent the next few days photographing the blocked ramp from every angle, catching the new locks, the angles of the chain, the way families hesitated at the entrance. Every image was a small victory, evidence that the HOA's narrative of obstruction was false. Hanford advised him to dig further. Together, they visited the county archives, sifting through boxes of zoning maps, old survey records, and aerial photos dating back decades. They pulled permits, property transfers, and historical easements that had long been forgotten. Each new document layered the foundation of their case. We need witnesses, Hanford said as they spread maps across Ethan's cabin table. County clerks, anyone who remembers approvals or past easements, their testimony can be pivotal. You can't just rely on paper. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of preparation and the hope that came with it. He started drafting a list of possible witnesses, including neighbors who had watched his grandfather maintain the ramp, and even the retired town engineer who had once walked the shoreline to mark the boundaries for public access. In the evenings, the cabin became a war room. Ethan pinned maps to the walls, stretching string to show historical access points, taping photographs and sequences that told a story on their own. Journals lay open, deeds fanned across the desk, a visual timeline of history, property, and fairness. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but necessary. Through it all, Ethan's family was quietly supportive. His sister called each night, checking on him, reminding him to eat, and his mother dropped by with coffee and sandwiches, refusing to leave until he had taken a few deep breaths. "You're carrying more than just papers, Ethan," she said gently. "You're carrying the legacy. Don't lose yourself in it." Hanford's guidance was steady. HOAs often push hard. Overreach is common, intimidation is common. But what we have here is solid. They can't argue with history, and they certainly can't argue with evidence. He paused. "We can force a hearing. You won't have to beg for fairness. They'll have to face it." Ethan studied the maps, the photos, the chain, the journal entries. Every corner, every note, every past signature formed a chain of proof that the HOA couldn't break. His anger from the early confrontations had evolved into something sharper: strategy, clarity, resolve. Late that night, he finally leaned back in the chair, looking at the wall of evidence, thinking of his grandfather's words: "Paper lasts longer than memory." It wasn't just about fighting a board anymore. It was about defending a family, a history, a promise. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders loosen, replaced by a quiet, dangerous confidence. The hearing would come. The hearing would come. The HOA would have to answer. And when they did, they would see that this fight wasn't a rash moment of defiance. It was a carefully built case, anchored in truth, justice, and decades of unwavering preparation. Ethan picked up his grandfather's journal again, the leather soft and worn under his fingertips. A single sentence jumped out at him, almost like a warning. "Those who take what isn't theirs will always be exposed if someone remembers." He smiled grimly. Let them come. They were about to find out exactly how much someone could remember and how far someone would go to defend what was theirs. The cabin, once a quiet refuge, now buzzed with energy, maps and photographs glowing under the soft lamplight. Every string on the wall, every note pinned carefully, every carefully documented photo told a single story. Ethan Walker was ready to fight, and he had allies, friends, professionals, neighbors, history itself standing with him. The lake outside rippled quietly, unaware of the storm being prepared on its edge. But inside, the war room was alive with determination. The tide was turning. Ethan leaned back one last time and whispered to himself, almost like a prayer: "They can't stop what's coming. Not now. Not ever." And for the first time in months, he felt hope not fragile, not hesitant but solid. Prepared. Dangerous. Certain, the HOA meeting hall smelled of stale coffee and tension. Folding chairs lined in neat rows were full, neighbors whispering in low tones, their eyes darting between Ethan Walker and the long table at the front, where the board sat like a jury. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, buzzing faintly, almost in rhythm with Ethan's pulse. He carried his stack of documents in one hand, yellowed plats, journals, photographs of the chained ramp, even the old deed his grandfather had signed decades ago. Each page was a testament, each photograph a silent witness. He laid them carefully on the small podium at the center of the room. The HOA president, a tall woman with a sharp bob and a suit that gleamed like steel, looked him over with the faintest smirk. She didn't greet him. She didn't shake his hand. Instead, she tapped her pen against her clipboard, eyes glinting with confidence. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice clipped and cold, "we're aware of your concerns, but our records show multiple violations of lake access. You've obstructed the public ramp. This meeting is your opportunity to explain yourself before further action is taken." Ethan lifted his head, letting the room fall into a tense silence. "Obstructed?" he repeated, incredulous. "I have never blocked the ramp. The only obstruction I've seen is the chains the HOA keeps putting back in place. I've documented everything. Photographs, maps, even historical plats that predate your board." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Some leaned forward, curiosity flashing in their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably, clearly afraid to speak. The president raised an eyebrow. "Historical plats are irrelevant. The HOA maintains the right to enforce community regulations regardless of historical claims." Ethan took a deep breath and pointed to the large survey map pinned to the wall. "Irrelevant? Look at this. According to the county records and your own legal filings, the boundaries you claim are misrepresented. This line here, marked in your map, does not align with the county survey conducted in 1952. or the easement agreement signed in 1960. He turned to the retired surveyor standing nearby. "Mr. Thompson, could you explain this discrepancy to everyone here?" Thompson stepped forward, cane tapping lightly against the floor. He held up a copy of the original survey, his voice steady but authoritative. "These lines, straight from county records, show the public ramp falls within the easement maintained by the Walker family. The HOA map is inaccurate. It ignores decades of historical access." The room shifted. Whispering neighbors turned into audible murmurs. Ethan could feel the energy shift. People who had once avoided his gaze were now looking with interest, some nodding subtly. The president's smirk faltered, replaced by a thin line of irritation. "Mr. Walker, these claims are speculative. You cannot simply bring old surveys and expect them to override current community governance." Ethan leaned forward, voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension. "Speculative? These are county records, notarized documents, and physical evidence. I've shown photographs of the ramp, showing no obstruction from my property. If this is about governance, it's governance built on false premises." A few neighbors whispered. "Finally, someone says it." Ethan caught a glance from the woman who walked the trail with her children, the one who had refused to meet his eyes before. Now she nodded slightly. The president's hand tightened around her pen. "You're making accusations that have serious implications. Be careful, Mr. Walker." Ethan held her gaze steadily. "Careful? I'm just stating facts. But if the HOA is trying to claim land for a private marina deal, something several residents have speculated about, then yes, this is serious. This isn't about rules. It's about a land grab. And I won't stand by while the community is misled." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Ethan felt the subtle hum of energy, tension finally balancing on a knife's edge. Some of the neighbors were leaning forward, others whispering, but none were walking away now. The president's voice rose sharp and tight. "You're threatening legal action with implications of corruption. That's enough. We will escalate this matter." She banged her gavel on the table. "Motion to refer this dispute to our legal counsel and pursue enforcement through formal channels." All in favor? Hands went up across the board. The motion passed. Ethan stood silently, taking a measured breath. The room buzzed with whispers, some supportive, some fearful. He picked up his documents carefully, eyes sweeping across the neighbors who were now watching him with a mixture of awe and relief. Outside the hall, the cool evening air hit him as he stepped through the doors. The lake lay in the distance, calm, reflecting the dim gold of sunset. His hand tightened around the stack of papers. They had escalated. Yes, but he hadn't faltered. He hadn't broken. They thought they were pushing him into a corner. Instead, they had just shown him the battlefield. And now, armed with evidence, allies, and the support of a watching community, he knew exactly how to fight. The first wave of intimidation had passed. The next would come in court. And Ethan Walker was ready. The hallway outside the meeting room was crowded, neighbors lingering, some curious, some anxious. Ethan felt the weight of every eye, every whispered question. He had challenged the board publicly, laid out the evidence, and now he could feel the ripples of tension moving through the community. Inside the boardroom, the HOA president regrouped with her allies, faces tight with frustration. Ethan lingered near the doorway, listening. They were muttering among themselves, concern creeping into their usual smug composure. For the first time, he caught the subtle undercurrent of motive talk of private marina development, potential contracts, revenue streams, and exclusive access rights that had nothing to do with the rules they claimed to enforce. "They've been trying to profit off this for years," Ethan murmured to himself, flipping through a survey he had spread across the hood of his truck. "This isn't about the lake. It's about control and money." Back inside the meeting room, he returned, calm but resolute. If the HOA's goal is financial gain, then the community deserves to know. I'm not here to attack personally. I'm here to expose the facts. This ramp has been public for decades. Any attempt to privatize it under the guise of regulation is unlawful. The president's face hardened. "You are making serious accusations again. This board has acted in good faith at all times." Ethan ignored the jab. He laid out photographs, side by side with the old plats and surveyor notes. Good faith doesn't mean ignoring history or misrepresenting property lines. These documents, verified by a licensed surveyor, show that the ramp has always fallen under easement controlled by my family. Your map contradicts every record I've found. The surveyor stepped forward again, cane tapping lightly. I've walked these boundaries, measured them against old plats. The HOA's current map is inaccurate. Anyone claiming otherwise is misinformed or intentionally misleading the community. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Ethan could see some neighbors finally raising their heads, nodding, whispering agreement. The tension in the room thickened, the board shifting uneasily in their seats. "Let me make this clear," Ethan said firmly, meeting the president's gaze. "This is not just a family dispute. This is about protecting public access and community trust. If the HOA continues down this path, they risk legal exposure, and the community will see the full scope of what has been attempted here." The president slammed her pen onto the table. "Enough. We will escalate this legally. Your claims do not absolve you from liability or fines. Motion to engage our attorneys immediately." Hands went up across the board again. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this. Their vote to escalate confirmed that the battle was moving to a new stage. He gathered his papers carefully, stacking each one with precise hands, eyes sweeping over the room filled with neighbors, some supportive, others wary. He didn't need to speak. The documents, the surveyor's testimony, the photographs, they spoke louder than any words could. Stepping out into the evening air, he felt the cool breeze of the lake against his face, carrying with it the smell of water and pine. The ramp, locked and chained again in the distance, no longer looked like an obstacle. It was a challenge, a call to action. Ethan's jaw tightened, resolve hardening. They thought the vote and the legal threats would intimidate him. They had only confirmed what he already knew. This fight would not be silent. It would not be passive, and it would not be avoided. He walked to his truck, hand brushing against the stack of documents in the passenger seat. Every photograph, every plat, every journal entry was a shield and a sword. He would use them. The neighbors trailing behind him whispered, some offering subtle nods of encouragement. He caught one woman's eye, the one who had avoided him at the walking trail, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. That quiet acknowledgement strengthened him more than words ever could. Ethan paused at the edge of the lake, looking out at the rippling water, the last light of sunset reflecting across the surface. The dock, his grandfather's dock, stood firm, despite everything. The ramp lay chained, but it would not remain so. Not if he had any say in it. He exhaled slowly. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, voice steady. "Not by a long shot. Let them bring the lawyers. Let them make the threats. They're about to find out what happens when history, evidence, and truth stand together." The papers rustled softly in the breeze, a whisper of the fight to come. Ethan felt a clarity he hadn't had in weeks, a purpose sharpened by confrontation, fueled by injustice, and tempered by preparation. The court would be next, and this time he would not just defend the ramp, he would defend a legacy. He turned away from the lake, shoulders squared, eyes forward, every step deliberate. The battle line had been drawn, and Ethan Walker was ready to walk straight into it. The courthouse loomed like a fortress against the cold morning sky, its stone walls reflecting both authority and intimidation. Ethan Walker parked his truck and carried his stack of documents inside, heart pounding, fingers tightening around the leather-bound journal his grandfather had kept for decades. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was history, law, and legacy colliding under fluorescent courtroom lights. The clerk at the front desk glanced at the folder Ethan carried. "Filing for Walker versus Lakeside HOA?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady though his stomach fluttered. "We're here for the hearing." Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and dry air. The gallery was half-filled neighbors who had whispered in hallways, families who had stared at the locked ramp, a few journalists with cameras tucked under their arms. The HOA attorney sat across from him, folders stacked like barricades. Their expressions were sharp, calculating, ready to pounce on any misstep. The judge entered, robes sweeping across the floor. The room fell silent. Her eyes scanned the room before settling on Ethan. She was middle-aged, professional, but her gaze carried an intensity that made him feel both seen and judged. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice firm but not unkind, "are you ready to proceed?" Ethan nodded, setting his documents on the lectern. Yes, Your Honor. The HOA lawyer, a man in a crisp navy suit, rose immediately. Your Honor, we contend that the defendant has interfered with public access to the lakeside ramp. Our evidence includes eyewitness accounts, board records, and multiple citations issued over the past 6 months. The defendant's claims rely heavily on outdated documents and anecdotal testimony, which we believe cannot substantiate his assertions. Ethan swallowed but held his posture, recalling the countless hours of preparation. He lifted the deed, first his grandfather's signature at the bottom, yellowed but clear. Your Honor, he began, this document, executed in 1961, establishes easement rights over the ramp. The HOA's claims contradict not only the deed but decades of recorded surveys. He gestured to a series of photographs he had enlarged. These images, taken within the last 3 months, show the ramp and surrounding access points exactly as they have existed for decades. No obstructions have been placed by me or my family. Any chains or barriers were added by the HOA itself. The judge leaned forward slightly, interest flickering in her eyes. Proceed with the survey evidence, she said. Ethan signaled to the retired surveyor, Mr. Thompson, who had been seated quietly in the gallery. The man shuffled forward, cane tapping the floor. Your Honor, Thompson said, I have compared the 1940s plat maps, county engineer records, and current survey pens. The HOA's claims do not align with legal boundaries. The ramp falls clearly within the easement controlled by Mr. Walker's family, as documented consistently over decades. Ethan had enlarged the maps on a board, each line and notation highlighted. The judge scrutinized them carefully, tilting her head. Are these survey pens verified by the county? She asked. Yes, Your Honor, Thompson replied. Each pin was physically located and cross-referenced with historical surveys. We also obtained verification from the county engineer. The HOA lawyer's expression stiffened. These are old records. They do not reflect current regulations or community governance. Mr. Walker is attempting to override legal authority with anecdotal evidence. Ethan took a deep breath. With all due respect, these are not anecdotes. They are recorded, notarized, and officially recognized documents spanning 8 decades. I am not challenging governance. I am challenging misrepresentation and overreach. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Neighbors leaned forward. Some exchanged looks, whispering names of those who had long suspected the HOA was overreaching. Ethan felt a surge of quiet confidence. The evidence was solid. The crowd was finally seeing it. The judge glanced at the HOA attorney sharply. Counsel, are you denying the validity of the county's historical surveys? We maintain that these surveys do not negate current community enforcement rights, he said, voice tight. Not negate, counsel, the judge replied, her tone firm. These documents establish ownership and easement rights. You cannot dismiss them without justification. Ethan's hands didn't shake. He had rehearsed every line, every counterpoint, every possible objection. When the HOA lawyer tried to interrupt, the judge raised a hand. One at a time. Mr. Walker, continue. He opened the journal, reading aloud a section his grandfather had penned decades ago. The lake belongs to the community. Keep the ramp open. Let all who come seek its water and fish find it accessible. The gallery shifted. Ethan could feel the weight of history pressing against the board's facade of authority. The HOA attorneys whispered to each other, clearly unsettled by the combination of deeds, maps, photographs, and now, the journal that tied intent to legal right. Your Honor, Ethan said, this isn't just about property lines. It's about honoring commitments made decades ago and preventing misrepresentation that could restrict public access unlawfully. The evidence shows the HOA's claims are inaccurate and their enforcement actions unjustified. The judge leaned back in her chair, rubbing her chin thoughtfully. She glanced at the documents, the maps, the surveyor, and the gallery. I will review the submitted evidence in detail. We will take a brief recess before proceeding with any testimonies or rulings. Ethan carefully gathered his papers, stacking them neatly. The tension in the room was electric. The HOA lawyers huddled, whispering quickly while neighbors exchanged cautious nods. The first part of the legal battle was complete, but the weight of what came next loomed like a storm on the horizon. Ethan walked out to the hallway, breathing in deep. The courthouse was quiet outside, but inside, the gears of justice had started turning. He could feel it. The first confrontation in court had gone well. The judge had taken note of the discrepancies, the survey pins, the survey-estral evidence, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He sat on a bench outside, reviewing his notes, rehearsing points in his mind. Each page, each photograph, each sworn statement had to be precise. They had escalated the conflict to the courtroom. They had chosen the battlefield, and Ethan Walker was prepared to meet them there, armed not just with documents, but with truth. The courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, the air heavy with anticipation. Ethan adjusted his notes on the lectern, the leather-bound journal of his grandfather resting beside the deeds. Every eye in the room seemed fixed on him, neighbors, board members, and even the gallery who had only come for curiosity. The weight of decades of history pressed against him, but he stood steady, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. The HOA attorney rose again, his voice sharper this time. Your Honor, we object to the presentation of historical documents as primary evidence. Mr. Walker's claims rely on outdated surveys, subjective interpretation, and anecdotal testimony. We maintain the HOA's authority over current regulations and dispute resolution procedures. The judge's gaze fixed on him, cold and unwavering. Objection noted. Counsel, the court will determine the relevance of evidence. Mr. Walker, please continue. Ethan nodded, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the so-called current regulations cannot override legal deeds, notarized plats, or documented easements. These are not subjective claims. They are legal records, verified by county clerks, surveyors, and engineers. I present here Exhibit A, the 1940s plat maps showing the ramp and adjacent access points. Exhibit B, the notarized deed from my grandfather establishing easement rights. Exhibit C, photographs of the ramp chained by the HOA taken within the last 3 months. He gestured to the enlarged maps displayed on an easel. The lines were clear, highlighted, annotated with decades of notes and survey markers. Each survey pin you see here corresponds to historical records and county verification. The ramp's location is indisputable. The HOA's current claims are inaccurate and inconsistent with legal precedent. The judge leaned forward, tilting her head. Counsel for the HOA, how do you respond to the surveyor's verification? The attorney faltered slightly. Your Honor, these maps are historical. We contend they do not reflect the current governance of community property. The easement's use is subject to HOA oversight, and Mr. Walker's actions could still constitute obstruction under our rules. Obstruction? The judge asked, raising a brow. Mr. Walker has presented evidence showing he has done nothing to block access. The chains and padlocks that prevent entry, who placed them? A murmur ran through the room. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances. The president's lips pressed into a thin line, her usual confidence faltering under scrutiny. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to the retired surveyor. Mr. Thompson, please explain the placement of these survey pins and their relevance to the ramp's legal status. Thompson tapped the floor with his cane. Your Honor, these pins were measured against the original plat maps and verified against current land markers. They confirmed that the ramp is within the easement held by Mr. Walker's family. The HOA's maps are inconsistent and, in some areas, contradict county records entirely. Any attempt to enforce fines or restrict access based on their maps is therefore invalid. The judge scribbled notes, then looked sharply at the HOA board. Do you dispute the surveyor's testimony? The president cleared her throat. We maintain that our intent is in good faith. Community governance requires oversight, but we do not dispute the accuracy of the county records themselves. The judge's eyes narrowed. Then it appears your actions placing chains and fines against Mr. Walker were done in contradiction of verified legal records. Is that correct? Silence. Ethan's chest rose and fell slowly. The room was tense, neighbors leaning forward. The gallery held its breath. You have provided substantial evidence, the judge continued. Deeds, maps, sworn testimony, photographs. The court finds that Mr. Walker holds easement rights over the public boat ramp. The HOA's restrictions, fines, and chains are in violation of those rights. Further, any continued obstruction or threats of enforcement by the HOA will constitute unlawful action. A collective exhale filled the room. Ethan felt relief, but he did not relax. He watched carefully, ensuring the ruling was complete. The ramp is declared public under the control of Mr. Walker's easement. The HOA is ordered to remove any restrictions immediately and to refrain from any further attempts to interfere with lawful access. Costs of legal proceedings shall be borne by the HOA. The court will issue written orders to enforce compliance. Ethan's shoulder slumped slightly, the tension easing from weeks of preparation, confrontation, and fear. The gallery erupted into quiet applause, neighbors exchanging smiles and handshakes. Ethan's eyes scanned familiar faces, some still cautious, others openly relieved. The HOA president sat rigid, a mask of composure failing to hide frustration. The board attorney muttered. Papers shuffled nervously, and even the room's air seemed lighter, as if truth itself had pushed through the weight of bureaucracy and intimidation. Ethan carefully gathered his documents. Every photograph, deed, journal page, survey map, proof of history, proof of integrity, proof of standing up to intimidation. He stepped outside the courtroom, sunlight warm on his face. Across the street, he could see the ramp still chained but no longer untouchable. The decision was official. The legal weight of decades of preparation, of family legacy, of careful documentation had shifted control back to him. He exhaled deeply, letting the relief and satisfaction wash over him. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement. Truth, preparation, and integrity could withstand intimidation, overreach, and greed. Ethan glanced back at the courthouse one last time. The battle had been grueling, public, and exhausting. But it was won. The ramp, the dock, the legacy his grandfather had preserved for decades, all of it was secure, under his control and legally protected. The lake beyond glimmered in the late afternoon sun. For years it had been a symbol of peace and community. Now it also symbolized justice. Ethan Walker had not just defended a ramp, he had defended history, fairness, and the principle that some things were worth standing up for, no matter the opposition. Ethan Walker parked at the edge of the lake before dawn, the sky a pale wash of pink and gold, and the cool morning air carrying the scent of water and pine. The chain that had been a symbol of conflict for months was gone, removed officially by court order. The legal notice, crisp and stamped, lay folded in his pocket like a talisman. The fines that had been piling against him, the threat of liens, the looming cost of legal battles, were dismissed. Each dollar, each threat, each intimidation tactic that had been wielded against him now dissolved in the authority of the court. The sense of relief was immediate, tangible, almost electric. Neighbors were already beginning to gather along the shoreline. Word had spread quickly. The lake's ramp, long contested, was open again under Ethan's easement control. People who had avoided him, whispered behind curtains, or nodded cautiously at the trail, now approached with tentative smiles and congratulatory words. Some shook his hand, others hugged him briefly, and a few even laughed quietly, relief bright in their eyes. Ethan waved, trying to stay composed, though his chest felt tight with emotion. He had expected satisfaction, yes, but the weight of community recognition, the understanding that he had fought not just for himself but for the neighborhood, was overwhelming. A small group of children ran past, squealing with excitement, heading toward the ramp with toy boats in hand. The HOA president and board members had been compelled to issue a public apology, as ordered by the judge. Notices were posted along the community bulletin boards, and a local newspaper had even caught wind of the story. A reporter lingered near the edge of the gathering, taking notes and snapping photographs, eager to capture the moment of resolution. Ethan barely noticed him, focused instead on the dock that had been his grandfather's pride and joy, the same structure that had withstood decades of wind, rain, and now legal battles. He stepped onto the dock slowly, each board creaking under his weight, memories flooding back. He could see it, the small hand-carved letters in the journal, the oars he had carried since childhood, the boats that had first touched the water decades ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandfather's journal, worn and fragile. Opening it to the page where his grandfather had written about the importance of fairness, legacy, and community, he read quietly to himself, "Let no man close what is meant to be open. Let every soul who seeks these waters find them free." A lump rose in Ethan's throat. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about honoring a promise made long before he had been born. A promise to preserve history, fairness, and community trust. He traced the words with his finger, feeling a connection across time, from the man who had built the dock with his own hands to the moment when history and law had aligned in his favor. He rose slowly, lifting his gaze to the ramp now unlocked and free. The children's laughter rang out as small boats splashed gently into the water, parents watching with pride and relief. Ethan stepped forward and opened the gate personally, letting the first few boats through. The act was ceremonial, almost sacred, a restoration not only of access but of trust and community spirit. Neighbors began to bring their own kayaks and canoes. Families who had been cautious now laughing freely, easing the tension that had clung to the shoreline for months. Ethan moved among them quietly, ensuring that each person felt welcome. Some older neighbors shared memories of his grandfather, stories of lessons learned on the lake and advice passed down about patience, persistence, and protecting what was right. A small group of residents approached Ethan, shaking his hand firmly. "You did what we couldn't," one said. "We were scared to speak up. You showed us it could be done." Ethan nodded, humbled. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all the people who remembered what this lake meant and wanted it preserved." The media, hovering discreetly at the edge of the gathering, captured the scene: Ethan opening the ramp, families launching boats, neighbors reconnecting, the water reflecting the morning sun like a promise kept. He could feel the story spreading even as it unfolded, an affirmation of community over bureaucracy, fairness over intimidation. As he stepped onto the dock again, hands brushing the weathered wood, Ethan felt the weight of months of confrontations. The threats, the isolation finally lift. Justice had been served, not in anger, but in truth and evidence. The ramp was open, the fines dismissed, the community restored. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe fully. The fight had ended, the legacy preserved, and the promise fulfilled. The lake, calm and welcoming, mirrored not only the sky but the victory he had earned through perseverance, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to what was right. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off the water and casting long reflections across the lake. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the ramp, watching as families moved carefully, almost reverently, onto the dock and into the boats. The air was filled with laughter, the rhythmic splash of oars, and the occasional cheer as a small kayak slid into the water for the first time in months. He felt the tension of the past weeks melting away. The HOA's threats, the fines, the public confrontations, they were all behind him now. Legal victory had been won, yes, but this, the community reclaiming its lake, its ramp, its access, was the true vindication. Neighbors approached, some offering quiet thanks, others more openly congratulating him. Their relief was palpable. Some had avoided the dispute entirely, fearful of reprisal, and now they were joining in the celebration. Ethan knelt beside the dock, opening his grandfather's journal once more. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. He read aloud quietly to himself, the words echoing in the morning stillness. "Protect what is yours, but remember it is never yours alone. Share it, guard it, and let others find joy in what you have preserved." A little boy paddled by in a tiny canoe, waving at Ethan. The sight brought a lump to his throat. He realized that this fight had never been about ego, or control, or even legal victories alone. It had been about keeping a promise made decades ago, about protecting a legacy that connected generations. Neighbors began arriving with more boats, some small, some larger, all eager to reclaim their place on the water. Parents guided their children, laughter rising like music across the lake, the tension of previous months evaporating into the morning air. Ethan moved among them, assisting with launches, helping a young girl steady her kayak, patting an older neighbor on the back as they stepped gingerly onto the dock. At one point, a local reporter approached, camera in hand. "Ethan, how does it feel to finally see the ramp open and the lake restored?" she asked. He paused, taking in the scene, children paddling, families smiling, neighbors reconnecting. "It feels right," he said softly, voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This lake has always belonged to the community. It always will. My grandfather built this dock and maintained access not for himself, but for everyone who comes here. I just made sure that promise was kept." The reporter nodded, capturing a wide shot of the lake, the dock, and Ethan standing quietly, a small figure amid families and the vast water. the story would spread, yes. But this moment, the restoration of trust and access, was something beyond headlines. Ethan moved to the gate of the ramp, unlocking it personally. Each click of the padlock felt symbolic, a small release of tension and a reclamation of history. As the gate swung open, a wave of cheers rose from the families, a chorus of relief and gratitude. Children launched their boats, splashing into the water with abandon, while parents laughed and guided them safely. The lake, once a symbol of contention, had become a symbol of justice restored. He stepped onto the dock again, hands brushing the worn wood, and thought of the countless mornings spent here with his grandfather. The memories of teaching him to row, to respect the water, and to value fairness flashed vividly. Every confrontation, every legal battle, every late night spent preparing documents, all of it had been. For this, the promise kept, the legacy honored, the community united. Neighbors lingered, chatting, laughing, and watching the boats glide across the lake. Some approached Ethan to thank him personally, shaking his hand, patting his shoulder, offering heartfelt words of recognition. Their support, once quiet and tentative, was now open and celebratory. As the sun climbed, the lake sparkled like a mirror, reflecting not just the sky but the collective joy of a community restored. Ethan watched a small canoe drift past, a father guiding his daughter with careful patience, and he realized the significance of what had been accomplished. It wasn't just a victory on paper. It was tangible, visible, and shared by everyone who had felt the weight of the HOA's intimidation. He closed his grandfather's journal gently, slipping it back into his bag. The words had guided him, strengthened him, and reminded him why this fight mattered. The ramp was open. Families were laughing. Boats moved across the water. History, law, and promise had converged in perfect harmony. Ethan looked out over the lake one final time that morning, a quiet smile crossing his face. The fight had been long, grueling, and at times lonely, but it was over. The community was whole again, the legacy preserved, and the lake, calm and welcoming, reflected the triumph of perseverance, truth, and the promise kept by one determined man. The days following the court ruling felt surreal. The lake, once a flashpoint of tension and intimidation, lay calm beneath the morning sun, its surface reflecting the sky and the promise of restored trust. Ethan Walker walked along the shoreline, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path, the gentle lapping of water against the dock, a soothing rhythm after months of conflict. News of the court's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. By midweek, the HOA president had resigned quietly, the resignation letter citing personal reasons. The whispers of internal investigations and financial penalties hinted at a much deeper reckoning. The board, once united in its assertion of control, was now fractured and under review. Outside auditors and county officials had begun combing through records, ensuring that no further mismanagement or overreach could persist. Ethan received word that new elections would be held for the HOA board. Policies were being rewritten, transparency finally prioritized. The community, once wary of speaking up, began participating actively, attending meetings, and voicing concerns that had long been suppressed. One of the first changes was the permanent protection of the public ramp under clear easement rules of victory, not only for him, but for every resident who had valued fairness and access. At the cabin, Ethan organized a small gathering of neighbors. Coffee and pastries were laid out on the weathered picnic table, and people shared stories of time spent on the lake, some decades old, others recent. There was laughter, quiet tears, and an unmistakable sense of relief. The community that had once seemed fractured and fearful was beginning to stitch itself back together. Children ran along the paths. Families paddled quietly across the lake, and the dock's grandfather's legacy was once again a hub of connection rather than confrontation. Ethan watched as neighbors helped one another launch boats, guided toddlers along the shore, and shared simple moments of gratitude. In these small acts, he could feel the restoration of trust, the slow healing of old wounds. Ethan had become almost inadvertently a community advocate. Parents asked for advice on how to ensure rules were fair, longtime residents consulted him on property issues, and local media reached out for interviews about how one man's persistence had restored a sense of justice. He spoke carefully, emphasizing the importance of documentation, community vigilance, and ethical leadership. Yet even amid this recognition, Ethan remained reflective. Sitting quietly on the dock one evening, Journal in hand, he thought of the courage it had taken, not just his own, but that of neighbors who had quietly supported him, who had resisted fear and spoken up when it mattered. The lake's calm waters mirrored his own contemplation, and for the first time in months, he felt at peace with the battle behind him. Neighbors passed by, stopping briefly to offer thanks. "We couldn't have done it without you," one said. Ethan shook his head gently. "We did it together. This lake, this rampart belongs to all of us. That's what matters." Evenings returned to a gentle rhythm. Families strolled along the shore. Children played on the sand, and the quiet lake scenes that had been disrupted by conflict slowly came back to life. Ducks skimmed the water, oars dipped rhythmically, and the wind whispered through the trees along the bank. The fight had ended, but the work of community, of trust, and of stewardship continued. And Ethan, standing at the edge of the dock, knew he would remain a guardian not just of property, but of fairness, history, and connection. Here's the closing reflection and new beginning. History 50 words section, written for cinematic narration and emotional resonance. Ethan Walker sat on the edge of the dock as the sun dipped low, painting the lake in streaks of gold and crimson. The water shimmered quietly, ripples tracing gentle paths across the surface, each one a reminder of mornings spent here with his grandfather, learning patience, care, and respect for both land and water. He traced a finger over the worn wood beneath him, feeling the history embedded in every groove. "Standing firm matters," he murmured, voice soft but steady. "Not for pride, not for victory, but for what's right. Some things, some places are worth protecting, because they belong to everyone, not just the powerful." He thought of the confrontation, the court battles, the sleepless nights, and of the neighbors who had slowly rallied, finding their own courage in the process. Legacy isn't measured in deeds alone, he realized, but in the principles passed down, the care for community, and the respect for truth. The lake was peaceful now, children's laughter long gone for the day, the water reflecting the fading light. Ethan smiled faintly, imagining future mornings, future generations learning the same lessons from this dock, from this ramp, from the fight that had ensured its protection. He stood, brushing off his pants, looking toward the horizon. Advocacy, vigilance, and fairness would continue quietly, steadily, in ways big and small. "And in the end," he whispered, eyes fixed on the sun sinking behind the trees, "truth outlasts power, and what is right will always find a way to shine." The lake held its calm, the dock stood firm, and a new chapter began, one grounded in courage, history, and the unwavering promise to protect what matters most.